So he really doesn't need any introduction. You all know and love him, so I'll just hand over. Thank you very much, Palden.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. Is this on?
The mic for the stage is that one there.
All right. Well, some of you know me and some of you don't. I lived in Glastonbury until 2008, from 1980 to 2008. I was instrumental in saving the assembly rooms from demolition. Started the first conference in Glastonbury here in 1983, and was instrumental in all sorts of things, including the town website. Later on, we had what was judged by Tony Blair's internet experts to be the best town website in the country. And but they decided to delete it from their report because it wasn't a proper town. Anyway, now I live down in Cornwall, in West Penwith, down at the far end. Pen means the end of something, with means beyond. So it's the end of the beyond. And I do a whole load of blogs and podcasts and things called Notes from the Far Beyond. And that's where I get to down there. You know, you can get into another state. It's a very good place after Glastonbury, by the way. If you want to defect from Glastonbury, West Penwith is quite a good place because there's lots of old veterans and weirdos there too. And we've got the same history. We've the same people who were coming here 100 to 150 years ago were also coming there to St Ives and Newlyn and places, the artistic wing of the Bloomsbury set, you know, and all that. And so, so there's an interesting connection. Now, some of you might know the ley line maps that I drew for Glastonbury. I did that during the Falklands War in 1982, the initial version. And it was fascinating because I started the map on the very day the war started. And I completed it on the very day the war ended. It's very, very peculiar.
It must be this cable here.
It was a very hot time too, which is often what happens when Britain gets worked up about things like Falkland Wars. Yeah. We get hot, dry, high-pressure weather. It's quite often the case that we get that. So that's where I noticed very much that there is a connection between the national mood and the weather. There is a connection between the two things. Yeah. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Because, anyway, so I drew this alignments map of Glastonbury. Frankly, I'd like to see it totally revised now. But it's what is. And then I moved down to Cornwall, and they've had quite a scene down there because we have more ancient sites per square mile in West Penwith than anywhere in Europe. And so we've got plenty to work with, and it's a very useful little area, actually. It's about 10 miles by 15 down here. And so you don't actually have to walk and drive around too much. And the other nice thing about it as an ancient area is that it's very contained because we've got cliffs on three sides, and there's only one direction of land. All the madness is east from us. It's all in one direction. The rest is open space. And if you sit on the cliffs down here at round Land's End, then you're looking towards the Caribbean, and right you're looking towards Greenland, and left you're looking towards Africa. And there's a very strong sense of global participation there, which is rather important for me because I'm rather sort of a global type of person, and I'm very much into the global consciousness, which is what I'm going to be talking about in a while. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the ancient sites, and then I'm going to move on to consciousness work, because these are very much connected. And I came upon this really through my work with West Penwith. And so anyway, this is Cornwall. Where's me dibber? Yeah. See if this works now. Yes, right. Okay, so Cornwall has an old history. The thing is, in ancient times, the action in Britain was around the Irish Sea. It wasn't in England. It was around the Irish Sea. And Cornwall, of course, is very well placed. And it was part of a zone going from the Pillars of Hercules, from Portugal and Spain, all the way up the west coast of Europe. Britain became the core part of it, but it went up to southern Scandinavia too. And then there were other parts like Malta, Sardinia, which were part of the megalithic world. And this was very important because classically, historians and archaeologists and things, they always tend to think that culture came from the Middle East up through Europe and eventually reached the primitive people of Britain. And it wasn't like that. The cultural influences actually came up the west coast of Europe from the Mediterranean and from the Sahara. And the people who started building megaliths in Britain in the Neolithic, they came from Spain, from what's called the Tagus River area, which flows out at Lisbon in Portugal, but it goes eastwards through Spain. And there was a meeting of people who came from Syria and probably Central Asia before that, and then people who came from the Sahara, which had been a green and quite civilized kind of area around about 6000 BC, dried up. Some of the people migrated up to the Maghreb, to the coast of the Mediterranean. The Berbers are connected with them. And so they met up with these people in Spain too. And then there were the indigenous Spaniards who lived there. And they formed a culture which began the megalithic period as we know it, and started migrating up to Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and migrating up like that. And so that happened. So the first sites in Britain really were getting launched around about 3700 BCE, 5700 years ago. And in Cornwall, we had things called neolithic tor enclosures. Up here, the equivalent is causewayed camps, which are hilltops with banks around them. Down in Cornwall, we have granite tors, which stick up and form all sorts of interesting shapes. And they started putting rings of rocks around the tops of these tors, which of course archaeologists will identify as defensive. I'm sorry, it's not like that at all. They didn't really have anything to defend, nothing to fight about. What they were trying to do, really, was they were trying to define humans as unique species. And they were coming into the new concept at that time of creating sacred space, or human space, because they were overwhelmed with nature. It was all around them. Down in Cornwall, well, Britain as a whole, at the beginning of the Neolithic, was 97% forested. And so if you lived at that time, your experience of life would have been inside a forest, and you would not have had a view more than 100, 200 yards very often. And that is a very, very different kind of life. And so these people headed for the hills. Down in Cornwall also, there was the coast. And so you have these things around here, which are called, archaeologists call them cliff castles. I call them cliff sanctuaries, because they're not defensive, again. These are holy places. They're consecrated headlands. And they're not just the obvious geological headlands either, they're chosen headlands. And I'll show you why in a little shake. And so you had the first temples, the first sacred spaces being built, which were on the hilltops or on the cliffs. The nearest cliff sanctuary to here is Breen Down. Do you know Breen Down? Now, you'll probably get the feeling there about what I mean by consecrated, because that place is consecrated. It is a very special place, and it's definitely got energy, and it's also got this amazing landscape sense there. I've had some amazing experiences at Breen Down, and I recommend it if you do inner work, you know, if you do dream work, if you do whatever it is you do, then Breen Down is actually quite a good place to do that, especially in a fog. These are all of the ancient sites in Cornwall. And I did a map of these as a cartographer. When satellite computer maps came along, it really changed things, particularly in the alignments area. John Michel would have been really quite, well, it would have forced him to really change his thinking quite a lot, because you can get much more accuracy with satellite-based maps. You can actually see where a cairn is, whereas a symbol on an Ordnance Survey map itself can be about 50 yards wide in terms of the space it covers. And so there's an inaccuracy there. And also there's a problem with Ordnance Survey maps to do with the projection of the maps, which flattens the maps somewhat. And the great thing about the Google Maps and the maps we have now on computers is that they actually incorporate the curvature of the Earth. And so the arrival of computer maps got rid of a problem that we've had in the whole business of alignments, which is about straight lines and the way that the curvature of the Earth affects them when they're more than 40 miles long. And so you couldn't really do long distance alignments very easily with the old paper maps. Plus the fact that you'd have to have a large empty room with lots of maps taped together with sellotape across the floor, you know, in order to do it right. I mean, I was working with, when I was doing the ley line maps of Glastonbury, I was working with maps that went from Exmoor to Wiltshire. And that covered a lot of space on the floor, and it was very, very difficult, actually, you know, to do that. But now you can get over that, more or less, anyway. There are limits to do with screen size and things. But anyway, so I've done a map of all of the sites in Cornwall here. That took me 7 years, that work. And so I live down here. You might not be able to see it in detail, but you can see there's a lot more sites here than anywhere else, apart from Bodmin Moor. The next one up, by the way, is Dartmoor, which will be over here. Dartmoor is very similar, and Devon used to be the same place as Cornwall until 1,000 years ago. It's called Dumnonia, until the English came along and did an ethnic cleansing in Devon. And there was a mass migration into Cornwall, and then there was another migration into Brittany at that time as a result of the ethnic cleansing of England. So where's my dibber? I've never done this talk before, by the way, so I'm really winging this one. Excuse me if I bumble around. All right, yeah, this is West Penwith. And this is the rough layout of it. And the fascinating thing with this is that life really started in the uplands, because the climate in Britain was really good, actually, during the Neolithic. It was about 2 degrees warmer. And during the Bronze Age as well. The Neolithic, we're talking about the 3000s BC, and then the Bronze Age, we're talking about 2500 through to 1200 BCE. And the Bronze Age was better than now as well. It was more like a German climate, more high pressure, crisper, sharper winters and warmer summers. And so the place to live was on the tops of the hills. this was the logical place to be. Why? Because it gives you a sense of space, there's more clear ground, fewer wolves and bears, you can keep your eye on your kids and your sheep much more easily, and you get a view. And the climate was good enough, so people lived on the uplands of West Penwith. Down here was just forest during the Neolithic. And as I was saying, the predominant issue during the Neolithic actually was that it was forested. This is very difficult for British people to get our heads around. And what the effects of this is, I only realized that I lived in Sweden for 7 years. They took me in I was a political refugee in Sweden in the 70s. And I lived in a forested world. It just goes on for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And I just had to get used to never having a view more than about 200 yards. And I used to dream of those vistas you get in Britain where you come along a road on the top of an escarpment and you just top the escarpment and there's a view for 50 miles. I used to dream of things like that, when I was sort of homesick, because you get terribly homesick when you're a political refugee because you didn't leave because of your own choice. So it can be emotionally quite a thing. Anyway, yes, so here are some of the main hills, therefore, in Penwith. You probably don't know them unless you've been there, but you've got a variety of things. You've got these things called the neolithic tor enclosures, which are big granite tors with sticky up rocks in funny shapes. Carnkinijik, Carngalva. You'll know this one, St. Michael's Mount is a neolithic tor enclosure. And another one is Trencrom Hill. One gentleman who has stood on this stage a lot, Hamish Miller, who died 10, 12 years ago or something. He lived right under Trencrom Hill. And so those were the holy places in the Neolithic, together with these cliff sanctuaries around here. And then there were later things that arrived as well. But so that's how it all sort of started with the sacred spaces in Penwith. And then it started getting more built up, in a sense, during the Bronze Age. They were really building a lot of stuff. And so you have some stone circles. Boscornen, you probably know of that one. It's got a very interesting stone in the middle which leans. The Merry Maidens, there's a destroyed stone circle called Tregerno, which is probably the largest stone circle in West Penwith at the time. That was destroyed over the last century or so, and in fact the last stones were removed in about 1997. Bloody criminal thing. Tregeseal stone circle was originally a double stone circle, now it's single, again destroyed by a farmer. Menantol. You've probably seen the Menantol. It's the one with the hole in the stone. Main is a stone, toll is a hole. So it's the stone of the hole. That was a stone circle. The current configuration of it with the circular stone and then two stones on either side were put there by a Victorian antiquarian who was over enthusiastic and decided to reinterpret the whole site. But basically it's a stone circle, and about 9 of the stones are visible there if you look around, and you can actually visualize it as a stone circle. So there was that, and then there's the 9 maidens here. So those were the stone circles, and then there were 350 menhirs, standing stones in all this, and then there were all sorts of barrows, 400-ish barrows, some of which are chambered ones. And the chambered barrows are very, very different from solid barrows. The chambered barrows were used for spiritual initiation, particularly for dying, but also for vision questing, also for treating tinctures and psychedelics, giving them an energy bath, basically, in And what they do is they locate one of these over the intersection of two underground water veins, which would create a vortex of energy. And then inside the chamber, it would be nicely covered with earth and rock. And inside the chamber, it would be a bit like an orgone accumulator, basically, a mixture of organic and inorganic materials, which is soil and rock. And so it would become a concentrated energy chamber. And so if you needed to do some energy work with yourself, some healing, some vision work, some dying work, some whatever it is you needed to do, then you could go in there, get closed in for a few nights or something like that during a full moon, what have you, and you'd have a serious energy bath with absolute zero outside vibrations coming into it. It's like a Faraday cage, really. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but when you're inside a place like that, such as the crypt of a church or a cave or a chamber like this, then basically your psychic capacities will grow tremendously. You can gain a much clearer ability to communicate with people and things at distance and stuff like that. So that's what the chambered cairns are about. The solid cairns are much more to do with landscape engineering, marking particular spots. They had all sorts of uses, actually. They were decorative, they were resting places, they were for burial, but only about 10% of them were really for burial. And many of the burials look more as if they're more incidental rather than the reason why the cairn was built. Why am I standing up? I need to sit down, excuse me. So the standard way of looking at these things, that these things were built for burial, again, this is an old archaeological prejudice, I'm afraid, you know. All they think about is defense and death, burial things. It's not like that at all. Again, these were sitting on top of smaller energy vortices, and they were basically accumulators. They were batteries, and they were what in computers you'd call sorry, I haven't got the word, but it controls the flow of information and energy. A buffer, that's it. They were buffers for energy so that you could kind of store surges and you can even out the energy flows in the land much more. So there were geomantic uses to these, there were burial uses, but again, this wasn't to do with memorialization of great people as we like to now, you know. I mean, I'm going to be dying soon, and quite frankly, I don't like the idea of being in a cemetery with a headstone recording me. You know, once I'm gone, I'm fucking gone. You know, and if you didn't catch me, then that's that. You know, I don't want this memorialization thing is a psycho-spiritual thing to do with the growth of our concept of self. Because now we have this terribly inflated idea of ourselves and the importance of ourselves. And it wasn't like that. The burials that happened in the Neolithic and much of the Bronze Age were usually collective burials. You'd have an urn full of the bone chips of like 250 people from a whole tribe. And so they would be a bit like a sort of a tribal memory stick of tribal memory of the tribal DNA, which was held there as a manifestation of the spirit of the tribe, of the people. And that's what these were all about, really. So these burials weren't for our concept of burial. They were much more to bless the land, empower the land. And some of the chambered cairns would have a great person in them, you know, someone who was revered as a holy person, and they would be placed in a good place, not so much to memorialize them as to bless the land. This carried on into the medieval times with the relics of saints and this kind of thing, and their miraculous powers that they were understood to have. Yeah, so these are the cairns and barrows of West Penwith, or at least the ones we know. You don't really need to know this, but you can see how they're mostly congregated in the highlands because they were really the earlier part of the development of the Bronze Age, which was the high civilization, or the highest megalithic civilization of all. But here, in the menhirs, the standing stones of Penwith, we have a colonization of the south. Why? They had bronze axes. During the peak of the Bronze Age, we got to 50% deforestation in much of Britain. 50%. By about 1800 BCE. From about 80% around about 700, 800 years before. This wasn't devastating deforestation as we know it now, chainsaws and things. This was hard manual labor. It took a long time to bring down a big tree, you know. And what they do is they basically just bring down a few trees every generation. You know, it was firewood, it was building material. They weren't deforesting as such, but they were cutting down trees, and it didn't really make a lot of difference because they did have a landscape gardening approach to things. When we go to ancient sites, we're very used to seeing them either manicured in the National Trust kind of sense or farmed. And they've been really decontextualized. But you need to think in terms of ancient sites being gardened. Think about that. And also being landscaped. That they chopped down trees in a thoughtful way in order to create landscapes. And this is an important development for humans because when we started deforesting and creating farming landscapes, we could look at it and say, we did that. That's us. That's our stuff. And then the extension from that is, this is our land. And so there's a very, very big change of consciousness that goes on between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, where during the Neolithic, we're distinctly guests in nature. Nature is still overwhelming us, but in the Bronze Age, we are creating the landscape much more. And so there's quite a difference of consciousness there. But it was still, during the Bronze Age, they still had what we could call a sympathetic attitude towards nature. It was to do with working with nature, not just blowing it up, chopping it down, and ploughing it and all the rest of it, you know. So it still had a sympathetic thing, but they were now going into the level of advanced civilization. Of course, what was special in Britain was that we didn't go into urban civilization. We were one of those civilizations that was able to come to an advanced level without needing to urbanize. People like, say, the Tibetans did this too at other times of life, or nomadic people as well, who can be culturally very, very rich. People like, say, the Dogon in Mali, who have all the mythology or the tradition of being descended from people from Sirius. And so you can have very, very advanced cultural understandings with quite simple civilizations. So this is where it starts getting interesting, because one of the things I found in my, well, what happened was this. I was talking to a woman called Cheryl Straffen, who's the grandmother of the Earth Mysteries movement in West Cornwall. And I was saying to her, has anyone done a map of this area, of the alignments and things? She said, no. And I said, well, do you think one should be made? And she said, yes. And so I said, well, shall I make one? And she said, yes. And so I started doing it. And the person who'd done the most work on this was John Michel. He wrote a book called The Old Stones of Land's End in the early 1970s, where he was seeking to demonstrate his point about ley lines and all that and how it all works. And he chose a particular area, and he chose West Penwith. And one of the reasons why it was good for him to choose that area is it's a very distinct area. It's not too big. If you do Wiltshire or something, then where's the boundary of the ancient area that you're working with? Whereas here it's quite definite. And so I started doing that, and then I started finding other alignments which no one else had found before. Been given a list of about 90 alignments, plotted them on the map, started forming patterns. And then I was sitting there one night, late at night, musing, and I was thinking about two places. One's St. Michael's Mount here, which is a granite serpentine plug standing up out of the sea nowadays. And the other one is Cape Cornwall, which is the old Land's End, until some Victorian came along with a theodolite and figured out that Land's End was actually about 30 yards west of Cape Cornwall. This was the old Land's End, and it looks like it much more. It's an upstanding pyramid-like promontory sticking out to sea. Now I was thinking about these two, thinking, yeah, they're similar. And I got out my ruler and I looked to see if there was an alignment, and it hit this, which is a bunch of 4 big platform cairns on the hill just above my house. And it suddenly went boing. And I suddenly realized those cairns, because they're not very impressive cairns, they're a bit worn down and it's a bit bleak and moorland up there. And so everyone kind of walks by. But actually it's turned out that this is one of the major alignment centers of West Penwith, Betrayer. And so suddenly I started looking around and finding these alignments between natural features, which then the very earliest sites were based on. So for example, if you go from St. Michael's Mount to another one of the cliff sanctuaries, Pendine Watch, Lanyon Coit is bang on it. And Lanyon Coit is also on another alignment that goes from Carnbray, which is near Redruth, further east in Cornwall. It's on the Michael line, and through Trencrom Hill. So that's 2 neolithic tor enclosures, and Lanyon Coit is bang on that alignment. And it goes through also the Tregeseal Stone Circle complex and hits some rocks just off Cape Cornwall. So suddenly I started finding a new set of alignments that no one had ever found before. And I call these backbone alignments. And they link the old Neolithic tor enclosures and the cliff sanctuaries. And usually the key sites in the area are all based on those kinds of alignments. And so here, have a look at this one. Palden Penwith. This is Gwenap Head, which is a name you'll know from the shipping forecast. They say Gwenap Head, fair to middling, all that kind of thing. Well, that's the southwesternmost tip of the Isles of Britain. And if you go up to the northeasternmost tip of the peninsula, which is St. Ives Head, lo and behold, Boscawen was located bang on it. And here's another one, Cape Cornwall, to another one of the cliff sanctuaries, Kemiel Point, bang on it. And here's another one. Well, this isn't quite the same, but this is Trerin Dinas, which is another cliff sanctuary, and it goes up here through Lanyon Coit, goes to the Nine Maidens. Well, Boscawen is bang on it. And so what took shape, and you might find this worth looking at this in Dartmoor, at this pattern, because there's a relationship between Penwith, Bodmin Moor, and Dartmoor. But I don't know if this kind of thing applies in other places. I haven't really looked. I've only done this work in Penwith itself. And so there's this new structure which has appeared, which in a way underlies the ley line structure of Penwith otherwise, which I'll show you in a shake. It's a very, very busy one. And these cliff sanctuaries basically are key components in it, together with the Neolithic tor enclosures. This alignment here from Pendine Watch through Carngalva, which is one of the Neolithic tor enclosures, Trencrom Hill, another one. It goes all the way east to a big place near Plymouth, the name of which I can't remember right at the moment, but that's one of those kind of 90-mile alignments, which becomes visible when you're looking at satellite photos of of a landscape. So what started coming together here was that this is an integrated landscape. Basically, this system of what I call backbone alignments knits together the whole landscape, and all of the ancient sites in some way are based on this kind of framework. This basically means that this is one ancient site, that these are not just individual stone circles and menhirs and things that are set up. These are an integrated system. In my book, which I haven't got published yet about it, I kind of say, well, Stonehenge, you might think you're big, but look at this one. You know, because everyone gets terribly worked up about Stonehenge and Avebury, but those, in a way, Stonehenge and Avebury are kind of like stage 2, stage 3 of the whole thing. And I'm kind of going back to stage 1, where it started. Where did the idea start? Actually, the idea was imported. It came from the stop before this was Portugal, and anyone of you who have been to Portugal and looked at the ancient sites there, they're pretty much like ours here, pretty much with differences. All right. So this is all of the ancient sites in West Penwith. It's pretty busy. And these yellow ones are the backbone alignments. This white one here is the Michael line. It doesn't hit St. Michael's Mount. It doesn't hit it. It doesn't actually hit Glastonbury Tor exactly either. It's 600 yards out. It's all right, though. It's all right. This is a global Great Circle line. And up to 3 miles for a, 25,000 mile line? No problem. This is a corridor. The most accurate alignment is this one. And so the fact that this is nearly a mile off, that's all right, as far as that particular kind of alignment goes. There's an interesting sub-alignment, though, that comes off it from the Hurlers, which is a stone circle up in Bodmin Moor that you might know. It's a triple stone circle, or even quadruple stone circle. And there's an alignment that comes down here, straight through St. Michael's Mount, and look where it ends. It ends up at Tolpedon Penwith, or Gwenap Head, the southwesternmost part of Britain. Fascinating. Those of you who like Hamish Miller and stuff as well, this is the Apollo line that goes from Ireland. He took it as far as northern Israel. It goes further than that. It goes through Jordan, Iran, India as well. So St. Michael's Mount is one of the most important sites in Britain, and it's also a national, in Cornwall, and it's also a national scale site, really. So these are all the alignments, very busy. You can see these, it's probably a bit foggy, but there are loads of red ones, minor alignments. And these are all accurate to within 3 meters. We have tight rules in the way that we measure alignments in Cornwall. So you don't really need to know that too much, but that's the extent of it. It's a really dense prehistoric environment, really. Just where I live, just here. I'm just surrounded. I look out of my window and I've got 3 ancient sites I can see from my window. Oh, right, that ended. Right, that's good. Good. So I wanted to introduce you to West Penwith because that was where I got this idea. Can we have the next PowerPoint, please? And that's where I got this idea, because I was looking at, okay, so what's all this about? It's about consciousness engineering. They were using engineering partially to work with their consciousness. They didn't have quite the same high-flying concepts that we use nowadays that are based in our religions and philosophies and things. They were much more naturally oriented. And the way they used to work with consciousness was to set up to engineer certain kinds of environments which would create different kinds of consciousness. So what's this? You start with holy wells and caves and chambers, which are to do with going inside yourself and becoming aware of the infinite from a viewpoint of, in a way, nothingness or darkness. And then in a chamber, when you open it up, a lot of the chambered cairns, for example, are oriented towards the summer solstice sunrise at that particular point. A lot, but not all. And so when you open it up, you've suddenly got this flooding out of consciousness. And then you have enclosures. In Penwith, we have 4 major circular enclosures on tops of hills. And inside those, you get a strong sense of up, but the banks of the enclosure, even though all of the enclosures in Cornwall are on panoramic spots, when you're inside the enclosure, you don't see the panorama. It's fascinating. There we go. Yeah, so this is just a slideshow of some of the sites. And so in the enclosure that I'm near, called Caerbrain, which is the stronghold of Bran the Blessed, and inside there, I think that was the Parliament site for the people of Penwith in the Bronze Age times, and it was a sort of a neutral space. Didn't belong to any of the tribes. It was a neutral space, right in the centre of the peninsula, and people would gather there, particularly at summer solstice, but probably other times, for a few days under the full moon, and they'd have meetings and early kind of legal decisions and marriages and ceremonies and trading and hobnobbing and meeting the relatives and having a great time and getting away from home and getting out of it together. You know, they'd have a right old festival, and in Caerbrain you could have 400 people very easily. Very nice space. There's an additional value to having the banks as well, and that's wind protection, which is a big issue in Cornwall. They'd create a wind dome over these things by having these banks, by rippling the wind and sending it up. It's because it's a major factor down in Cornwall. We get gales. Oh, right. Gone that fast. Right. Well, okay. I'm going to deliver you the main point there. Because what I'm talking about here, about an integrated landscape, is that they were feeding into the major sites. They were feeding energy into the major sites. With menhirs, they'd be located on top of water lines under the earth. They'd be aligned with other sites, which would create an alignment connection. Some of them were astronomical as well, but not many. And so they were plugging these things into the earth, the cosmos, other places. And then things like menhirs were built for upstepping the energy of other sites, such as stone circles. Menhirs themselves aren't really sacred sites. They're helpers. They're ways of pumping up the whole thing, so that you can feed energy into a place such as a stone circle. Now, what happens inside a stone circle? You've probably sat inside stone circles yourselves, and the consciousness possibilities inside stone circles are greater. You can go into an altered state much more easily than you can in many other places. And in Cornwall, for example, in West Penwith, the background radiation inside stone circles is at least half of what it is just outside. And so you get a definite energy shift. And so what they used to do would be they would call people together, and they'd choose a very good time for this as well. They'd choose what I call a PowerPoint in time. And some of my books have been about this because I'm an astrologer. And so in the 80s, I wrote a book called Living in Time, and then I did a revision in the mid teens called PowerPoints in time, as ways of identifying these PowerPoints and how to judge what their qualities are. And full moons and solstices and equinoxes are the obvious ones, but there are much more. So they'd choose a PowerPoint in time, they'd call all the people together, and so you'd have a few hundred people around the stone circle, all of one or a few tribes, and they had all done this for generations. They knew what to do, and they would be fasting perhaps, or perhaps they'd be out of it a bit on mushrooms or things like that, seriously. And they'd get themselves gradually working up this energy with dancing, chanting, yeah, building the energy. And then the site itself would, stone circles are located on top of blind springs or water domes, which create a vortex of energy. And so the stone circle is channeling that energy. It's containing that energy and channeling it up and down, and also distributing it out in a sort of a tangential kind of way. It sort of sends energy out in a tangent way. And Tom Graves, the dowser who used to live in Glastonbury, he used to call this the cyclotron effect. That basically, if you start ceremonializing, chanting, moving around the stone circle, you'd be creating a spin. And you're building up an energy field. What is the purpose of building up an energy field here? It's really practical stuff. It's to do with the inner, sophisticated, quite complex workings of shamanic religion, shamanic practice. This is a more developed kind of thing than shamanism, but I wouldn't exactly call it religious in the way that we came to know later on with the world's religion. It was still very direct experience, shamanic work. And so what would they be doing? They would be doing healings, advanced healings. And these people were doing, at times they were even doing things like trepanning, drilling holes in the top of the head, all this kind of stuff. So their medicine was much more advanced than we really know or understand, although a lot of it would, of course, have been things like herbal stuff, herbal remedies and things like that. But they'd also be doing shamanic work here. Then there's the question of weather modification, because menhirs are sat on top of water networks, and so they will have an effect which is not dissimilar to lightning conductors. Not exactly the same, but they will tend to even out the energy flows between land and sky. And one of the things that we in modern times forget too much to our peril is that weather is about electrical energy. It's not just about CO2 and all these kinds of things. It's about the electronics, the energetics of the atmosphere and the way that it interacts with the stellar domain and with the earthly domain. And as an electrosensitive, I'm a very electrosensitive person. I think one of the major causes of climate change at the moment isn't, well, CO2 has a stake in it, but basically electromagnetism is a big one. Much, much bigger than we would like it to be. And a very, very serious issue, not just for individuals who are electrosensitive, but for the planet as a whole. And it's all to do with the electronics. When it rains because the charge potentials are right for it to rain. When it blows, it's because behind all of the changes in temperature and pressure and stuff in the atmosphere, there is electronics, or energetics, you could say, bioenergetics. And so what a lot of these sites were doing was they were regulating the climate. They were evening out the extremes. And one of the things now, although we bang on a lot about global heating and all the rest of it, really the critical thing is what we call weather events. It's the critical weather events. the gales, the storms, also the earthquakes and things like that, which can come along and really blat and change an area. And you get areas such as, say, the Philippines, which get blatted about once every 2 years with something really serious. And it does have a very, very major effect on the attitudes of people and their willingness to live in an area and to deal with this kind of stuff, you know. And so this is about dealing with the weather extremes, which include bad harvests, really cold winters, bad storms, you know, all of those kinds of things. So weather control comes into this too. There's ecological control as well, which is about encouraging the spirits of the land and the energy fields of the land and of nature and of animal species. I will be ending soon. And of animal species which tend to even things out. And the prevailing belief in Glastonbury really works around this whole basis. You know, make the gods happy, do things which make nature feel better. And this is what they were doing, except to a much higher degree, much more sophisticated degree than we are now. They were working really with the inner forms and patterns of nature in a shamanistic sense. And then there were other reasons too, which I'll just skip through. One is distant communication. We have this issue in Britain, and that is that there is a pretty, not uniform, but the whole of the megalithic system from Orkney to Cornwall has similarities all the way through it, even though there are lots of regional variations. But basically all the patterns are kind of similar. And this means that there was a lot of traveling going on, but there was a lot of inner communication too. This isn't so remarkable really, because we're all mad on mobile phones nowadays, and that's a modern technological version of the same thing, is that internet and mobile phones have in a way been a kind of a substitute for inner psychic communication. But it is us getting closer in a funny sort of way. So there's that. And then there's also the regulation of human affairs, about the actual happiness of society. And one of the interesting things about Penwith is that it's never been invaded. Anyone who's come along, Vikings, Saxons, Normans, Romans, they didn't touch Cornwall. Right? And it's not just because of its isolation, because from a maritime viewpoint, it's right in the way. But I would say that this is a national defense issue. If you're concerned about national security, then you work with the energy of the people and the land to build up an energy field which is so strong that a world superpower cannot beat it. This is the issue today in Ukraine. That was the issue in Vietnam. This is the issue in Iraq, in Palestine, and all the rest of it. And so here, my final point is this. I do a lot of work with earth healing, planetary healing work and stuff like that. And if you see my blogs and my Facebook pages and stuff, I go on about it a bit. And this is about building up thought forms, mind fields, reality fields, which are, we're in a battle today for the hearts and minds of humanity about thought forms, about the basic pattern of our planet. And many of you will see it perhaps as the notion of, say, a matrix versus the people, or however you want to see it, you know, but there's something very, very basic going on here. And what I'm saying is that really we need to tune into this same thing, this work with the psyche, the collective psyche of humanity. And so we can learn something about this, because if we want to do things like correct our climate and correct our ecosystem, yes, all of the things we're doing now are very relevant, but there's another stage after that, which is yet to come in future generations, which is to work with the subtle energy of this, to work with the underlying archetypes, the underlying energies, the consciousness behind it. How conscious are we as a human race in creating our reality as a human race? Are we actually capable of saving ourselves from major disaster? That's the really big question, you know? And so there's something rather interesting here about this build-up of consciousness, which the ancients were working with. And our next speaker, he was mentioning to me outside when we were chatting about how he was going to talk about the fall. Well, the little bit I'd add here is that we went through a fall in a way in Britain. The critical point was the end of the megalithic period, around about 1200 BCE, and it suddenly went from a kind of a theocracy, in a way, through to warlords very, very quickly. And so here, after 1200 BCE, we get the hill forts, and we get a major change in the nature of life in Britain. It didn't only happen there, but that was, in a way, the critical point in Britain, where there was a downfall of this conscious civilization. This civilization which was sympathetic towards nature, which worked with the collective psyche, which worked in harmony with the forces of nature and with the powers that be. And we went from that to a competitive, territorial, militaristic kind of culture which basically prevailed after that. And so in a way, where we stand now is at the reversal point of that. If we're going to get anywhere, our particular version of it in Britain is in some way to do some restoration of that kind of conscious civilization, using consciousness as the basis for the way in which we steer things, and also reorganizing our world, the architecture, the land use, the agriculture, all the rest of it, reorganizing it to work with the planetary and the cosmic energies. You all know that. And what I'm saying really, and what I'm saying here, yeah, what I'm saying here is that ancient sites, they were working with this too. And so there's something for us to learn from those today. This is not just a historic, interesting thing, but it's to do with the future. So thank you for your
Thank you very much. Oh. Great. So yeah, I saw this hand there first, please.
Hello.
Glastonbury are doing a beating of bounds walk on first Wednesday after May Day, after Beltane. Are there any similarities, other things that you try to walk, as in which way round, any kind of ceremonies that were done as a kind of protection for beating of bounds? We're doing
do what feels right and be inventive.
Okay.
I'm not one for systems, I'm afraid. And so
is to instinctually tune in. What's the right thing to do? Let's do it. And that's the way I'd go, because we need to listen. We need to overcome our rules, our structures and things. We need to loosen up our thinking about the way to do things. An example, I'm nowadays running a weekly meditation on Sunday evenings. One of the things a lot of the people like about that is I'm saying to them, do your own meditation. Do it in the way that you do it. Invoke your own gods, say your own mantras, do your own method. Let's just do it all together. That's where the power of it lies, really. So a commonality of intent, but everyone's doing their own thing at the same time. And I think we need to go into that to retrain ourselves. We're too educated, and to retrain ourselves so that our systems of thinking are of value, but in the end, what decides it is down here, and it's in your feelings. It's what feels right at the time. Listen, So I'm sorry, that's a terrible answer to that.
No, brilliant. Yes, please.
Thank you. Palden, thank you so much.
Hello.
When you say about human consciousness and thoughts and feelings affecting the weather, I totally agree. We've just seen a brilliant example of that in New Zealand. During the pandemic, New Zealand autonomous shut down regimented countries in the world. It was just completely over the top, and a little tiny Pacific island away from everywhere else. We were hardly affected. We had this dictatorship in place. And so in the 2 years since then, we've had this people recognising that they're losing the rights to speak, the freedom of speech, and so a huge groundswell of protest has occurred. And just a few weeks ago, we had a huge cyclone blow through New Zealand, the first time ever a direct hit. The winds of change are blowing through New Zealand, and you know what the name of that cyclone was? It was Gabrielle. Gabrielle is the archangel to do with communication. So you're spot on. It's happening, and we need to be aware of these things and take the steps to bring us back into balance and understand how our sacred lands and our sites, our mountains, our rivers are all part of this consciousness, and we can work with them.
Yeah.
So I really value your work. Thank you.
And there's another dimension to this as well, and I think many of you will have experienced this in various of the things you've been part of, which is that sometimes if you do ceremonial or consciousness raising work of any kind, and if you've been working at it with a group of people for some time, quite often you can get some very interesting weather phenomena going on. And I had this a lot when I was organizing camps in the 1980s and 90s. We'd get a lot of synchronicity between the weather and things we were doing in the circle. I'll always remember one. I was running a thing called the 100th Monkey Project in the 1990s. We were doing consciousness work with world events. And that week, it was a week-long retreat, and that week we were working with the idea of infusing the power structures and the oligarchies of the world with new thoughts and new energy. And so anyway, we did all this, and we were working with specific issues at the time. And then we came to the last day, and it was home time day, and the lady who was my assistant, she had just gone up to the farm, and she came down and she said, "Palden, that something's happened, and I don't know what we should do about this. Princess Di has just died. Should I tell them?" And I said, "Yeah, go ring the bell and just shout it out, And so she goes into the center of the circle and says, "Listen, everybody, got something to tell you. Princess Di has just died in Paris." What happened then was an enormous thunderclap, and the rain suddenly bucketed down, and it was one of those where you just had to run for it, And you get things like that. I've had this here. We had a wake once for a chap called Just Incredible. Do you remember him, Justin? And he committed suicide. And we had a wake here, and everyone was kind of being polite, regretting his death and wishing all that kind of thing. And something came up in me, and I said, "Justin, you fucking asshole, why the fuck did you leave us?" Suddenly, thunderclap, rain coming down on the roof, and I don't know if you heard it, but it'll drown out all the sound if it's really a monsoon. You get these amazing things. I mean, it's difficult to say where the cause and the effect of these things is, but the fact that they happen together is very, very significant. And that's unconscious weather control. That's where we had built up enough energy to, in some way, assert an influence, but we weren't conscious and in control of it. Yeah? But if we can move into a space where we can work with this much more consciously, then we're talking about weather control. And many of you, if not all of you, will have had experiences of these kinds of things in your own lives.
Sorry, we've only got 15 minutes till the next speakers. So maybe if people want to break now, and we can just do one more question. So just feel free to listen to the question or break for 15 minutes and come back to the next speakers. If that's
Yeah, I'll be quick on this one.
Okay, I was just put in mind of a writer up in Stonbury, called North Hill. She wrote a book that was based partly around one of the stone circles in Cornwall. In this particular part of the story, there is a ballet that's performed inside the stone circle called planetarium, which is all about the planets in the solar system and how they all interact with one another. But straight after the ballet, the heavens open up and there's a massive storm that happens. And I find it interesting that a writer who, in a way, must have been conscious of any of this stuff has actually written that, placed it in a novel.
And it is also, it's one of those not uncommon experiences we all have,
which most people just edit out of their memory. They'll only remember it at certain other times. It's a funny one, really, the way we edit that out.
I just thought it was very striking, so just studied that.
Yeah.
It's based on castle in something, which is another stone circle like 14.
Yep. Okay, thank you, everyone.